Hello, everybody. My name is Chiara, and I welcome you to Liminal Podquest, which is part of the content produced by Boom Festival in these interesting times, together with the interviews that go under the name of Boom Toolkit for COVID-19. We invite you to check them out. And I also take this opportunity to thank our friends at Unite for streaming our content on their platforms.
So, the feminist writer Audre Lorde wrote, "It is not our differences that divide us. It is our inability to recognize, accept, and celebrate those differences." And with today's episode, we hope to see if we can shift that inability into an ability and a desire to recognize and accept and celebrate all our differences. Black people, people of color, indigenous people, ethnic minorities have been dehumanized for centuries. And a narrative has been slowly created that says that non-white lives are not as worthy as white lives. All lives matter. Yes, I agree with those three words, but this phrase has been used to dismiss, ignore, and deny that Black lives, which have been targeted, stigmatized, and marginalized, do indeed matter. So our wider systems and institutions are still very discriminatory against different racial minorities. We see this in predominantly white juries in courthouses. We see it in non-diverse boardrooms in companies, as well as nonprofits. We see it in Indian caste systems. We see it in the number of activists, environmental activists in Amazonia that are being murdered from indigenous communities. Lists are limiting, we know, and there are many who fall between these cracks. But we're just trying to give an overview of the injustices we see around us today and that we're more informed of because they've been happening for a long time. So what happened last year was a sort of climax of the Black Lives Matter movement, which was a global call for recognition and protection. And this often starts with an open and vulnerable conversation with a political flavor. And what this all means is that we sometimes need to pause and check our privilege, listen more than we speak. And that's why we're stepping back as hosts today and passing the baton to somebody more capable of holding this conversation. And we're here to listen.
She's a journalist, translator, and cultural producer, working for more than 10 years with Black communities in Portugal and in Germany. She's also working as a curator, researcher, and consultant for several initiatives in the academic and social movement spheres. In 2015, she founded Afrolish, a cultural association that promotes and spreads the life stories and work of people of African descent. Carla Fernandez. Hi, Carla.
And over to you.
Hello, Yvonne. Thank you so much for the presentation. I'm very happy to be here with you all. So we are living in a delicate moment in history, not only because of the COVID-19 pandemic, but also because of a rise in awareness around social and racial inequalities. Together with the continuation of systemic racism, there seems to be a new determination around the world that things can no longer remain the same. In different parts of the globe, there is a call for collective action, like the Black Lives Matter movement, which has made people realize the impact of continuous global actions. Today, we're going to talk about these issues and more with our special guests, Emilia and Camille. Both have work based on an intersectional approach to social justice, and they will give us their take on what the path to collective liberation could look like. Emilia is a political scientist with degrees from German and French universities. Some of her work includes the analysis of processes of intersectional discrimination in French and German labor markets for care and household services. She founded the Center for Intersectional Justice and also worked with migrant women. In academia, Emilia taught intersectionality theory, post-colonial studies, and critical race theory at the Humboldt University and the Free University of Berlin, and international and European law at the Jean Moulin University in Lyon. She also worked on human rights issues in different organizations in countries like Germany, Tanzania, Uganda, and Cambodia. In February she published her book, Why We Matter, Das Ende der Unterdrückung, The End of Oppression. Camille Burton is an interdisciplinary artist, educator, and embodiment researcher who uses Afrofuturism to imagine creative interventions towards systems change. They are invested in breaking down the mind-body separation that is dominant in Western paradigms in order to create more space for flexible thinking, holistic healing, and bridging across differences. For 5 years, Camille ran the Collective Liberation Project and developed a trauma-informed approach to diversity and decolonization work that centers the body and lived experience. Camille is the head of Ecologies of Transformation, a temporary master's program at Sandberg Institute, exploring how art making and embodiment can facilitate social change. They are currently researching grief on behalf of the Global Environments Network, creating a toolkit of embodiment grief practices to support efforts for intersectional ecological justice. Camille also works as an advisor for MAPS, ensuring that psychedelic assisted therapies will be accessible to global majority communities most harmed by the war on drugs. So welcome, Emilia and Camille, to this Liminal podcast. Thank you so much for being here to share your experiences with us. So the first question, which is a very pleasant question always, is how are you doing? It is really intended that you answer this question. How are you doing?
Shall I start, or do you want to start, Camille?
No, go for it, Emilia.
Okay. So first of all, I'm very happy to be here. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to the next hour speaking with the two of you. It's just really an amazing space that we have, so I want to make the most of it. And to your question about how I'm doing, I had a beautiful birthday weekend. I spent time in nature. I spent time with friends, things that I hadn't done in a long time in this setting. And yeah, and so it was very beautiful. I also felt a very strong new moon in Aries energies, which were definitely yeah, quite intense. Yeah, and at the same time, I'm very exhausted.
Oh, yeah. Thank you, sweet. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm doing, I think, as well as can be in this moment. It feels like there are so many waves of different things happening, and it's quite overwhelming at times. But I feel grateful to be in a moment where I'm taking some rest and yeah, trying to integrate some experiences from this year, from the last 2 years, really.
Yeah, actually.
So yeah, I'm doing okay. Very glad to be here with you both and have this conversation.
Thank you so much for sharing. So this conversation will mostly focus on racial justice. So I would like you to give us a small idea of what you think that might be racial justice. We can start with you, Emilia.
So racial justice as a term is a very important term. It means that we need to employ it more often. You know, instead of speaking against, I mean, we can speak about anti-racism, definitely, but using the term racial justice is in and of itself transformative. And I would say, especially in the European context, where there is an aversion towards race and a very deep discomfort towards race. And so asserting racial justice and speaking about racial justice really brings the reality of racialized people in the forefront. And I would say, I would say that racial justice is really about dismantling white supremacy as a system. It's about dismantling the white superior norm and understanding that this is the norm and the line that has structured our human interactions. And there's not only this line, because when we speak about racial justice, we need to also have an intersectional lens to it and know that We cannot reach racial justice if we're not fighting patriarchy, if we're not fighting ableism, if we're not fighting capitalism in the meantime. And so that's why racial justice is a frame that can help us envision a future in which all human beings will see their bodies and their worth not being defined according to the racial hierarchy that places white people on top and people of color, Black people, Indigenous people below with different scales. And so, yeah, racial justice means liberation. It means freedom from these hierarchies, which are really oppressive and also dehumanizing. Yeah, I would say that.
Thank you so much. Camille, your take on it?
Yeah, I think I would like to pick up on what Emilia said around dehumanization. And if I was to kind of simplify it down as much as possible, I'd say that racial justice work is aiming at moving away from dehumanization, actually accounting for the centuries of dehumanization that have existed institutionally, interpersonally, in many of our systems and societies, definitely in the Western world and in many different cultural contexts globally as well, and actively taking steps to repattern those harms, to firstly acknowledge that they're there, and take active steps to address and rebalance those harms so that all beings and all lives can really be valued and honored fully.
Thanks. I'm going back to Emilia, but both of you base your work on an intersectional approach or using intersectionality as a tool. Emilia already talked about intersectionality, but could you give us a definition of what intersectionality is, and why is it so important to consider intersectionality while tackling systemic racism?
Intersectionality is it's not just a theory, it's really a political project. It's a political project that helps us understand oppression as a phenomenon that has, it's like a monster with 3 heads, and you never kill the monster if you only kill one head. You have to look at it in its entirety to really understand how it works, because patriarchy feeds capitalism, which feeds racism, and vice versa. It means that if you have a system that relies on the strength of the other systems, and those 3 main systems are really capitalism, racism, and patriarchy, and then with, of course, their byproducts and their subsystems, such as classism, such as ableism, such as fat phobia, such as, discrimination towards the LGBT community. And so intersectionality is really going deeper in the fight for justice. It means that, there's a definition that I find quite useful, because it says that intersectionality is about fighting discrimination within discrimination, tackling inequalities within inequalities, and empowering minorities within minorities, right? So it means that we never rely on monolithic, homogeneous categories that say very little about the complexity of who we are as people and about the power of these systems of oppression. And there's another thing that I'd like to mention in order to also speak about intersectionality, and that's the dehumanization. And currently, oppression relies on the line of humanity. And everything that is non-human, everything that is considered to be non-human, can be destroyed, it can be violated, it can be hurt without consequences, because that's what defines the worth of living beings. And so people who have been dehumanized, and we see that, in genocides, in all forms of genocides or breaches against human rights, that, for example, Jewish and Roma people were considered to be rats in the Holocaust. We see that, disabled people are considered to be monsters. There's always this like visual dehumanizing.
In Rwanda, these cockroaches.
Cockroaches, exactly. So the dehumanization of people enables doing harm to them, enables killing them. And so that's why we have to reflect on this line of the human, because what if also things that are not human deserve respect, deserve respect, deserve love. It would completely change our discourse. It means that it would not be enough to say that somebody is not human to justify the harm, to justify the exploitation. And so that's why we need to expand it. And intersectionality is also about this. And if we expand that, we can also understand the full depth of the climate injustice. And we can see that climate justice can only be achieved if we confront the line of humanity. If we understand that not only human beings deserve respect and love, but also every particle of the universe. And so that's why it becomes really, we need to have a spiritual approach to all of this, because it's not enough to just cognitively understand, oh, there are human rights and there are treaties and there are laws, and this is wrong. We can't just move ourselves in a moralist frame or a legal frame. We have to go deeper in our souls to really combat this injustice. And to me, this is what intersectionality is. It's really understanding the intersection of spirituality, social justice, the intersectionality between the different social movements, understanding that reaching climate justice will not happen without confronting the line of humanity, without tackling racism, without tackling patriarchy.
Thank you so much. And all this trauma that Emilia was talking about, this aspect of dehumanization, also reflects in our bodies. Now, Camille, your work looks at how our bodies respond to trauma caused by systemic racism. No? So can you tell us, how do our bodies respond to racial trauma, and which are some of the strategies that you have developed to deal with it and to heal it?
Thank you for this question. I should say that, we all have different nervous systems and different bodies, so there's not kind of a one size fits all where we can say that this is how everyone is affected. But in terms of a generalization we could make around the impact of racial trauma, generally, if you're living your life and you are experiencing surveillance, if you are being perceived as someone that's dangerous or not safe, someone that is potentially a threat, that will have an effect on your nervous system. That will often put you into a sort of higher sympathetic nervous system state, where you might be more in fight or flight, or you might be feeling that you need to defend yourself. If this continues over prolonged amounts of time, this can create lots of hypervigilance. So the sense that you're always kind of being watched, or people are potentially going to harm you, which isn't a far-fetched thing if you're existing in a Black or a melanated body in the world right now, right? But in terms of the body, it can create a sense of being mobilized and ready to either defend yourself or to run away. And this can have a lot of lead to kind of chronic stress, lead to lots of different forms of illness over time. In terms of how we move through the world and take up space as well, for people that experience racial trauma and other forms of oppression too, there can be a sense of shrinking in the body, wanting to become more invisible. Smaller, taking up less space, seeing less as a threat, because if you're making less movements, then maybe people won't feel like you're going to, be someone that can cause harm. So on a kind of daily basis, this is something that's quite common, I think, for a lot of global majority people, is this sense of shrinking, becoming smaller. And there's other things as well, like dissociation, not actually being able to feel and sense into the body as much anymore, because of not maybe feeling comfortable to exist in it because of these conditions, because of being seen as a threat, because of being dehumanized in many ways. So there's, a lot of other components I could get into, but those are just a few threads to kind of.
And which are some of the strategies that you've been working on or came across to deal with this?
I think the idea of dealing with it is a really subjective thing, right? Because I don't think that even if we can come back into our bodies and learn to take up more space and learn to regulate our nervous systems, that's not going to stop the ongoing systems that create that response in our bodies. I think what we can do, though, to use embodiment tools in such a way where we can start to notice if the threat that we're feeling matches the moment we're in. And if it does feel safe enough to actually do something to calm our nervous systems down so we can come back into our bodies, so we can begin to notice what safety within ourselves can feel like. That's one thing. And when we cultivate more of that, hopefully build resilience and capacity to change the external structures that create the harm to begin with. And this is something that one of my teachers, Nkem and Defo, talks about and names alchemical resilience. This idea of not just cultivating resilience, because this is a term that's, I think, used in a way I don't really like very much.
Yeah.
People are like, you're so strong, you're so resilient, because you can just continue dealing with all of this chronic amounts of harm. That's not what we're going for, but more around how do you learn to kind of rest and take moments to come back into yourself when it feels safe enough to do so, and how do you build enough capacity to really change these existing structures that do continue to re-traumatize and create more and more harm. So I think there is a really important role for embodiment work, but I think we have to be careful not to believe that it's about the individual and about one person just feeling good, but it's more around how we can create a sustainable resources for ourselves to feel strong, to feel nourished, to be able to collectively create change and repattern the conditions that we're existing in.
Yeah, I wanted to suggest your grief portal that you have on Vimeo. So would you say that's also like one of the tools that we can use to do so, to come back to our bodies, to settle down and to...
Yeah, I think grief is a really powerful resource and a sort of untapped resource in many ways. It's not very convenient under capitalism to grieve, because we're not productive workers, right? When we're too in our feelings. So we're not really encouraged to do that. And many cultures in the West have kind of lost all of their practices around grief. But the Dagara people in what's now known as Burkina Faso, they have some really beautiful grief practices, and several people from that community that do a lot of work internationally, sort of sharing around those. Maledoma Some and Sobonfu Some. Sobonfu passed a few years ago. But what they talk about in the Dagara context is that people within the community are expected to come to the community grief ritual on a monthly basis. If people don't show up and do their grief work, it's seen as a kind of taboo, because to not do that is believed that this grief will come out as forms of violence, as other forms of harm, because it's not being processed, it's not being tended to. And this really resonates with me, because I noticed that if something happens to me, if some harm takes place, then I'm more likely to respond in a way, consciously or unconsciously, that may pass some of that energy on. So even on a really base level, you know, I think that we can learn a lot from looking how cycles of violence repeat themselves, and those who often are harmed will often go and continue to pass that harm on. I think when we can be more in touch with what's moving in our bodies, what we're carrying from our ancestors, and what has been often unaddressed from them, because many of our ancestors haven't had the time and space to even take stock and grieve, because they've just been in survival mode. I think there's a lot that we can learn, and also to create more spaciousness and to create connection within our communities as well, and to organize around the things we need to grieve. So yeah, I think there's a lot of resource within that as well, and like learning and creating new practices and rituals also, because it's not so simple for many of us in the diaspora to necessarily connect to our indigenous practices, but I think we can create new methods and new ways of doing this work.
Thank you, Camille. So I do suggest this grief portal by Camille Barton as a powerful exercise for us to connect with our bodies and our grief as well. And I do confess that I did the exercise, and I after the exercise I cried, and during the exercise I cried, And during that day, I really felt like I was moving on clouds because I really felt the connection. I mean, we're going to share everything here, but I really recommend you guys to go into that exercise. So we'll have the link on the comments as well. So let's go to Emilia. Emilia, so writing might also be a way of dealing with trauma. And did you feel that way about your book? Because I ask you this because although I haven't read the book yet, I went to the online premiere and I heard some of the excerpts which were read, and it seems like a very personal journey because you have chosen to put yourself and your very diverse family in the center to talk about the various intersections of racism that racism bears. So tell us more about the book, Why We Matter, Das Ende der Unterdrückung.
Thank you so much. And yeah, Camille, there's so much, so much of what you say that resonated with me, like on a deep level. Writing the book has been definitely healing for me, very much so. And I could see that a lot of things were locked in myself, and writing was a process of just letting go and getting it out there. And so that's why I didn't really feel any blocks or any, I was just writing and writing pages after page. And it was just like really crazy because I also didn't have so much time. I was writing, it was in the pandemic. My son was with me. I had no childcare. So I was writing, from playgrounds. I was writing when he was asleep at night. So I just really didn't have time. But every time it was just like, I felt so good after writing because it was my truth that could finally be on paper, something that could not be denied anymore, or something that sometimes I felt like I was afraid of losing it, of losing this truth, because it's constantly put in question by our society. We're constantly gaslighted about what we feel and if our perspective is true. And so it feels like I have to hold on to it to keep it alive, so to say, right? And so writing was this process of putting it on paper and knowing, okay, it's there. So I felt really relieved, and it was healing because I felt that I was doing it for the past generations too. I was writing this book for my mother, for my sisters, for the generations before me, for my grandmother, etc. And this transgenerational trauma was very much present. I dedicated this book to my aunt, my great aunt. Although in the process, I mostly had my family from Martinique and my ancestors who were enslaved more than this other part of the family. But my great aunt was murdered in the Shoah, in the Second World War, and she lived in Germany, and she was killed as well from Germany. I mean, she was transported to a camp and was killed there. But for me, this writing this book was also part of healing her too. She was very much present in the process, and that was very, very powerful, especially around the release of the book. So I am really looking forward to doing your grief meditations or grief exercises. And in the meantime, I'm doing breath work, which is for me a method that I've also found to practice, to heal and to also connect with grief. And I really definitely felt that presence. And for now, what I know is that the book is out. The book is out there. It's living its own life. And I, of course, put a lot of myself in there. But I don't see it as, it's not just me. It's not me, the individual. It's more connecting with the humanity of other people. So this is really what I wanted to achieve by having a connection that goes beyond myself, something that is also speaking to other people who may not have at all, the same identity or the same experiences, but we can, strike a chord that we all have in common that very often gets lost. So yeah, healing and every kind of artistic expression, for me it was, and I speak about it as artistic expression or creativity. But anything where we put ourselves to it is healing parts of ourselves, I guess, even if we don't realize it, even if we are not doing it explicitly or intentionally. I think it has this process, our soul has its history and it is also acting without our consciousness sometimes.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Emilia. I think we could talk much more about your book, but I would like to advise you who are listening to us, if you speak German, to watch the video, and advise you, Emilia, if you have the possibility to get it subtitled. Yeah, that's the book. That's the cover of the book. But to get that, at least this video subtitled, so that more people have access to this powerful content. I also really connected to many of the experiences that were shared, and I think that more people should have access to this information. Well, Camille, you have also stated in an interview for the podcast Embodied Life with Lauren Taus, that looking at our family dynamics can be a way to decolonize our own history. So I would like you to help us understand this perspective. So how do our bodies reflect our family history, both visibly and invisibly?
Thank you for the question. Before I answer, I just want to also give some celebration to you, Emilia, with this book. And I'm so, grateful that you're spreading this work also in the German context, because there's such a dominance of these conversations in English, and then it becomes harder to really do this work in the German context, or in the, in the context of Portugal, for example. So I'm really, really excited when I see people doing this in different languages too. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And also thank you, Carla. I will try to make the subtitles available in English. Thank you for the suggestion.
Please.
I will.
So that I can also talk to other people about
it. Thank you.
Yes. But with family contexts, I personally think that ancestors are such an important space to kind of do our own healing work, whether that's understanding maybe where some of our wisdom comes from, and also maybe where some of the pains and the kind of intergenerational harms that keep on popping up, where they kind of come from as well. And maybe similar to Emilia, I also come from a pretty mixed background. I have Nigerian ancestry, also Guyanese ancestry, and then Celtic English ancestry on my dad's side. So a lot of different dynamics and peoples and stories and power relations on either side. I think that intergenerationally, there's a lot of trauma that we kind of can get passed down. And for those who have a more scientific approach or like to think of it from that way, there's the study of epigenetics, which is really taking off more and more, looking at how certain genes get switched on or off depending on the experiences that our ancestors had. And so based on the current research, we can see that this kind of has an impact up to 3 kind of generations back at least. Not to mention then what that means for your grandmother, who would have been impacted 3 generations back from her people. And this really kind of creating a lot of impact on our behaviors, as well as certain things within our bodies. So for example, a lot of Black women, we have fibroids, right? We have a physical manifestation of womb trauma from generations and generations of sexual violence through the transatlantic slave trade and also through colonization. So I think, I'm just rereading the question, decolonize our own history. I think I want to also reframe the term decolonize. I know it's very popular. I know people use it a lot. A friend of mine called Nima Getere, who's an indigenous Kenyan person and theorist, was really kind of encouraging me to start using the term re-indigenize, which may feel a bit prickly for people, but I'm more and more moving towards wanting to kind of advocate for things rather than move against, similar to what you said earlier, Emilia, was saying racial justice as opposed to anti-racism. And in thinking about re-indigenizing, I think we're confronted with thinking about where that severing took place for those of us that are from global majority backgrounds, right? Thinking about where was the severing from our kind of indigenous way of being, and what were those stories, and how do we kind of come to terms with the yeah, the harm and the discomfort that might be there in that process. I know for me, with some of my Nigerian ancestors, my great-great-great-grandfather was taken into enslavement for a time, but then he was dropped back in Sierra Leone with many people who became what's known as the Saro people, because when slavery was ended by the British, you had lots of missionaries that set up shop in parts of the continent, namely in Sierra Leone, where they kind of met the newly freed people that were enslaved and kind of indoctrinated them into Christianity, educated them in the kind of ways of the West, and sent them back to the communities they had come from to basically perpetuate colonization, to perpetuate Western dominance and these new ideas spreading throughout the continent. And this is what happened to one of my ancestors. And so his two kids went on to become the first lawyer and the 8th doctor in Nigeria. And in their own ways, they subverted their power, one of them more than the other. They subverted their power to do certain things, like my great-great-grandfather Oguntola Shapara was able to reintroduce plant medicine into Nigeria because it had been banned by the colonial government. And so there are things like this that you could see as progressive, but there's also the fact that they were still part of that system, right? They were still perpetuating colonization, perpetuating these ideals. And so I think it gets quite complex when we look back into our ancestral realities and understand the different dynamics at play, the ways that that can show up in our present realities around certain forms of superiority, certain ways of being. And the interesting question for me is, how do we learn from these stories in order to move towards solidarity with all different kinds of beings, with other humans as well? And how do we, understand what these legacies mean in our bodies and how they show up in our families currently, and what work we can do within our own family ecosystems to really repattern these traumas so that we can move closer towards collective liberation and I guess analyze our own complicity in a way, because I think that in this moment there can be quite a lot of binary thinking around victim and oppressor roles, that we can only exist in one, when actually I think we can be wearing multiple hats in different moments. And I think it's more helpful overall. For me, it's been helpful to try and break down this binary and trying to understand that, yes, in many positions I can be victimized by certain things, and also I need to be mindful that I can still reproduce harm. And so how do we create accountability structures that can be cognizant of all of that and allow us to take stock of what power we have and how we can really use that in service of collective liberation and of more kind of
intersectionality. That's it. This intersectional approach. Yes. Thank you so much. Emilia, the Black body is not always read in the same way, and it does tell different stories of colonial contact. A bit of that was also said by Camille. As you shared in the premiere of your book, Emilia, for instance, when you go to Martinique, you can be read as white or métis. So this is like the different take on power structures. No? In that place, maybe you can be read as someone with much more power than in Europe. But you were very happy to be read as a black person, along with your mother, who is of darker complexion, and your sister when you were in the US. So being in certain places as a Black person might also be read as a dispute of territory. Would you agree with that? Belonging to a community or not belonging to a certain community?
Mm-hmm. So thank you for speaking about that, because the core of it is really the how white supremacy permeates the entire globe, even if there's no large-scale white majority anywhere. In the context, if we look at India, if we look at the Caribbean, and if you look at Asia, for example, I'm never seen as white in Martinique. I was mentioning Senegal, which is a place that I went when I was 20 years old, so a very long time ago. And I remember a situation where at some point, a cousin of my very good friend, I was visiting there, asked her, but Emilia, is she really white? And then my friend said, oh no, she's not white. She's like half black, actually, you know? And there I realized, yeah, I mean, yeah, I can be read as black. I can be read as white in many countries of the African continent. In Martinique, it's not the case because clearly, you know, like there are white people, and the Caribbean is really, you know, the mix of well, skin complexion and yeah, and different types of blackness is really present. And what I think what has been quite uncomfortable for me was to realize, you know, understanding as well the exclusion, some of the exclusions that I felt maybe in Martinique and in other contexts, like in France, where I know that was not only my skin complexion, but also my hair texture, and also my traits that, you know, I evoke less blackness than, say, my sister, for example, who has Afro-textured hair, kinky hair, I don't know how to use, nappy hair. She has, you know, much more African features, but she has a lighter skin than me. And she is, you know, I would say that as the very primal racist, racist hostility that she will experience it more than I do. But then it's also more than that, because, you know, like, we have to look at our lifestyles, we have to look at where we are located, we have to look at our family constellations. You know, the fact that she's married to a white man, well, automatically his white privilege will spill on her a little bit. Of course, it will never make her white, for, you know, of course not, but she will definitely benefit a little bit from that whiteness and from, you know, his maleness. And I, as a queer person who's also a single mother, you know, that's why it's all eminently complex. And as you said, Camille, we're never only oppressed. Some people can be only oppressors, you know, like a lot of people only have axis of oppression and only axis of privilege in their identities. But I don't think any single, I mean, yes, there are people who really accumulate all axes of oppression, but all of us on one or more axes do benefit from a system. You know, if I look at myself, there are a lot of axes, and it's easier to ignore them because it's not comfortable. And so I see a lot of people who will entirely focus on, you know, for example, their blackness, but ignore that they benefit from patriarchy. They will emphasize on, you know, their disability, but also not recognize that they benefit from whiteness or from class privilege. So that's why it's so important to do so, because we cultivate our empathy, we cultivate our ability to divest from systems of oppression when we are on the side of the oppressor, because this is what is most difficult to do from an ego standpoint, you know. And I think that a lot of people who are on the side who embody oppression also need healing, right? There's a lot of healing that needs to take place for people who have oppressed and also past generations. If we look at Germany as a country, there's so much healing that needs to take place and that isn't taking place. And that is really making the country such a difficult place to live in, because all of these trauma are not tackled and are not, you know, that there's no recognition, and it's just replaced by guilt or by denial or by blame. And these are not, feelings or emotions that can be constructive, right? Because you can recognize that you have responsibility, and responsibility doesn't have to be attached to guilt, doesn't have to be attached to blame. And that's a very different thing, because if you endorse your responsibility, then you can engage on a healing journey. You can also recognize that these systems are harming the oppressors. And as long as we don't recognize that, I think we will only go half the mile, right? It will not enable us to really fully come to the unity that we really need, to come to the connection that we really need on a higher level. Yeah, I think I lost track of your initial question. Yeah, it was about skin color.
You did, but it was beautiful. Anyway, so you made a very beautiful detour. So thank you for sharing that too. Camille, you work with drug policies and see psychedelics as a tool to heal racial trauma. Tell us about how psychotropics in a white body might be understood and how that is different for racialized bodies. And through this, you can also talk about the challenges in advocating MDMA psychotherapy to be accessible to people of color or the global majority communities, as you often put it. So how can psychedelics be used to heal racial trauma?
I think psychedelics hold great promise in healing all sorts of trauma, including racial trauma, because, yeah, they can connect us to, I don't want to say spirit necessarily, if that's not what moves for everyone, but to something greater than this material existence, and to a sense of ourselves as really being interconnected with all forms of life and really being worthy and part of being here, you know, very much belonging to this place, to this life, and entitled to live it. And as we've kind of touched upon in our conversation, a lot of racial trauma can actually detach us from our bodies, from our sense of worth, make us feel small, make us feel apologetic for our existence. So I think there's a lot of power that these substances have in being able to reconnect us to our brilliance and our beauty and our passion for this life and the sacredness of our existence. I think where it becomes tricky, though, is the war on drugs. It's not necessarily easy to just experiment or explore with these substances, because on top of these legacies of historical trauma, you also have had a drug war for the last, you know, particularly amped up since the 1980s, but definitely since the 50s. And even before that, with prohibition from colonization, you know, with our plant medicines of our ancestors being severed and banned upon colonization. So it's been happening since then. But with the war on drugs moving forward, drug policies have really been the main mechanism used to criminalize, incarcerate, and at times kill global majority people in various countries around the world. So as we're now in this moment of psychedelic renaissance, as it's being called, yeah, there's a lot of work we need to do to kind of illuminate these histories and understand that certain communities, even if they are and have been the medicine holders of these traditions for generations, actually are not in the same position to just access these medicines, right? Because there's been so much targeted kind of violence and criminalization against Black and brown bodies via the war on drugs and state-sponsored violence. And it's not really ever been about the drugs, really, but these policies have very much conveniently been used against our people. And now in this moment where they're becoming mainstream and there's a lot of conversation about the research and how brilliant it is, I think we need to really address what repair would look like. And part of this means expunging records and getting people out of prison, you know, even for things like cannabis conviction, which, you know, more and more as cannabis legalizes or is decriminalized in different parts of the US, for example, there are some really great policies that are coming through with organizations like the Drug Policy Alliance, who are making sure that the marijuana legalization comes with getting people out of prison, expunging their records, and actually allowing licenses for communities most harmed by the war on drugs to enter that market legally. But unfortunately, this isn't the case across the board. And I think we're going to run into similar issues in the psychedelic space. And already we are, because the clinical research that's taking place is massively overrepresented with white people. And as a result, there isn't much attention that's been paid to ensuring that therapists and clinicians and researchers doing these studies have any kind of cultural humility, training, or unconscious bias, or even an awareness of, you know, what the war on drugs has done to our communities, or the impact of medical apartheid and experimentation on Black and brown bodies and things like this. So I think there's a lot of work to do to kind of create the stage that will allow for our communities to actually benefit from these medicines. So on paper, it's brilliant. And I think there's a lot of promise. In practice, there's a lot of work that has to be done to actually allow for these medicines to be accessible and to create policies and an industry that will allow that to happen. So I really hope that's a conversation that can keep on happening in the psychedelic space, and for those that are really committed to these medicines to start understanding how key racism is as a factor within all of that conversation, and something that we'll have to unravel more if we really want all people to be able to benefit from these medicines.
Thank you, Camille. As you have heard, I think that this could be developed. I mean, we could dig in more in this answer, but we have to go on to another theme, unfortunately. So this one is for both of you. Do you think that COVID-19 pandemic is making people think more about what a just society might look like? I mean, with the example of Black Lives Matter, again, Black Lives Matter movement receiving so much more attention now. Would you say that the COVID-19 pandemic is doing something for us to reflect on those issues? I would say Emilia now, because Camille just...
So I would say that there's, 1 year into the pandemic, we can see that last year at the same time, there was so much hope, so much time as well to pause, like it was a little bit, this time that is needed for us to think about new futures, to articulate our vision. We need time for that. We can't do that in the capitalist hamster wheel, it's just not possible. And so what I see is that 1 year into the pandemic, we are left with one thing, and that is wage labor. It means that everything else stopped, art, culture, social activities, everything that was feeding us and that was creating a sort of balance between what we gave to capitalism and what we derived from it has disappeared. And now it's even so that, I remember at the beginning of the pandemic, people had understanding for, saying, oh, sorry, my child is at home, I don't have childcare. And now today, I feel like I have to feel more and more, I'm apologizing constantly for having to bring my son when the state is not guaranteeing that we have childcare possibilities. And it has become, widely accepted that we need to work and we need to put wage labor at the top of our priorities, and that this is our identity now. We don't have any other things in our lives. And that's, it shows us how powerful capitalism is, how powerful neoliberalism is, because it just doesn't allow us to think about justice. And especially the most precarious people don't have this luxury because, rich people can go to their house in the countryside on weekends or can work from there, and they have like a very nice environment. But people who work in really small places don't have that luxury. That being said, I think that the pandemic is making a lot of social problems visible that existed before. It's more exacerbating our consciousness of them. And so in this sense, it's a chance, but if we're not using it, it's going to just do one thing. It's going to reinforce capitalism as a system. And we see that, for example, very, very large companies who are not at all trying to bring any social change, on the contrary, are gaining a lot of power through the pandemic. And this is something that, the power imbalances are getting stronger and stronger. So COVID in and of itself, I don't think it was also the reason why the Black Lives Matter movement got so strong. I think we have gone through a leap of collective consciousness last year and in the years before, like something around there that was energetically, that just created a readiness for humanity to see things that we were not ready to see. We're not ready to fully acknowledge. And I think, of course, everything is linked. So maybe it was also contingent with the pandemic. But the fact that the Black Lives Matter movement was so strong and so wide last year, and hopefully will continue to be, I mean, of course, there has been also a slowdown with this, has to do with the fact that we're in a transformation phase. It is happening. Transformation is taking place, and it is also bigger than us. So that's why I think we need to bring humility to the process and know that what we can do is really continue our collective and individual healing. It's like surrendering to the process and also trusting that change is happening. It's not if we change 1 or 2 policies that it's going to happen. And sometimes that's also what I'm trying to convey in social justice movements, trying to say we need to bring patience, humility, and trust and faith. And these are 3 things that are not currently taking place because we take ourselves way too seriously as people, imagining that our very actions, which leads as well to burnout, because we think we need to do this and that and this, and then we are completely forgetting that we have limits, and then burnout like every 6 months or every year. And so COVID is part of this transformation, part of this change.
Camille,
Yes.
would you like to share?
Sure. Yeah, I resonate with a lot of what you said, Emilia. I think there is a lot of transformation. I was really struck last year by thinking that a lot of the distractions were gone, right? Well, when I say distractions, I mean also the things that you were saying give us life, allow us to have balance. But I think before, a lot of people were kind of in a rhythm of 9 to 5, take substances on the weekend, legal or illegal, and like let loose and then go back into that cycle. And so they're not really paying attention to much beyond their sphere of existence. And then suddenly, having to be forced inside the house, really forced to confront our bodies and what they need and touch or care or whatever these things are. I think that, there's a reason why suddenly embodiment is trending, and often in a way I don't feel comfortable with, but suddenly people are like, oh, I have a body and I have to do something with it, and it has all these needs and it's uncomfortable. Whereas before we could externalize a lot more and kind of bypass many things. And I think in the context of George Floyd's murder, and I think equally the distractions that people had that allowed them to be like, oh, I'm not really into politics, or I'm not really going to spend time on that. I couldn't really look away from it. It was just there and you had to engage with it. And I do think that it's a factor of like lots of work being done over many, many, many generations to get us to that point, kind of meeting COVID in this sense of people being collectively sort of physically trapped and focused in a way that they wouldn't necessarily have been before. And so I kind of agree with what Emilia was saying as well around people being more aware of the different kind of inequalities that were going on before, but again, are just heightened through this time. And I'm hopeful that a lot of people who maybe were a bit more apathetic or a bit more, liberal, are being kind of radicalized to see the brutality of capitalism and wage labor, and the brutality of how that operates within patriarchy, and the huge disproportionate impacts that this pandemic is having on female socialized people, right, on women's bodies, and the labor that we're just expected to do, just to keep everything going, without really any pay and any acknowledgement. So my hope is that, even though it feels like there's a lot that's kind of static and we're still waiting and we have to be in this rest space, I'm kind of trusting that there will be a lot that moves when we can move again, because there's a lot that has become very clear, and I feel like the veil has really been pulled back, and there's a lot that isn't new. It's not like these things are new, but it's just that they're super visible, they're super present and loud. And I hope that we'll be able to really transform and use this as an opportunity to regenerate in ways that will sustain more life.
So as a closing note, I would like to ask each one of you to give your personal take on what collective liberation means and what the path towards it could look like.
Okay, I guess I'm doing.
Yeah, this is a ping pong, Emilia, so it's your time.
I think collective liberation means to liberate ourselves from the hierarchies that define our worth, because we're so caught into that we can only define our worth according to the inferiority or superiority of others. So it means that we're not really able to look at who we are as, you know, pure souls who are worthy no matter what. You know, we don't need to do something. We don't need to achieve anything. We don't need to be a certain way. And that's something that we have internalized from the day we entered this earth, basically, because this is what society teaches us, and we are passing it on to our children. And I see how, you know, seeing my child evolve and how early it begins, and how, yeah, how caught we are in those hierarchies in everything we do. This is the only way we know how to exist. And so that's why I feel like collective liberation means completely divesting from this way of thinking, completely divesting from these systems of oppression. And in order to do that, the only thing we can do is inner work. I mean, and that's why more and more I'm moving away from, you know, what we initially were doing at CIJ, doing advocacy in the classical way or working with these frameworks and structures. And I find them so toxic today. When I look at them, I'm like, no, this is not the type of energy I want to work with. I don't think it's really even effective. It's like, this is part of the matrix that we need to escape. And so, yeah, liberating ourselves from this matrix and really understanding that this is about our beliefs, our consciousness, and we can change the way we have seen each other, the way we see ourselves, and the way we see the planet, our environment, the way we see life more generally. Yeah, and I do a book recommendation, which maybe you know, Camille, you know, of course, Sonia Renee Taylor. So the book is called The Body's Not an Apology, and she's really opened my perspective when it comes to divesting from the ladder. So she says really divesting from the ladder. She also says there's no right way, there's no wrong way of being in a body. So really trying to develop and invent new ways of being in this world. I think this is our task, and this is how we can liberate ourselves.
Thank you.
Yes, I love that book so much. Yeah, for me, I think just building on what Emilia said, I think collective liberation is really moving from a space that's not around like one single issue. I think that sometimes people can get confused with the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, and think like, oh, it's just like Black people wanting to have supremacy. And it's like, that's really not what it is. This is about moving from a space where we can understand that we're all connected, and that none of us are going to be free. None of us are going to really be able to be in our full worth, in our full agency and capacity to be our truest, kind of most shiny selves when other people are being oppressed or marginalized. And that our ability to kind of be liberated is so interconnected also with our ecosystems, with our four-legged animal kin, you know, with the marine life, that we're really trying to create new systems and structures that allow all of us to kind of sustain and celebrate life for, you know, the next 7 generations to come. And I think that that has to happen, again, like Emilia is saying, not just on a kind of legal policy level, not just in the written word. We really have to change our relational ways of being, the ways that we operate and kind of meet each other and interact in our daily nonverbal interactions, and really demonstrating care, demonstrating what it means to not dominate in our interactions, and to understand that as not just about me trying to save someone else or because I pity them, but because it's about my humanity or my ability to be a being in this world that is honoring the life that exists outside of myself, and knowing I'm connected to it, that there isn't actually a separation. So I think it's, it can be really a deep and spiritual, profound work to be doing, but also intellectual, can really tap into many things. But I think it's about, understanding that we are more than just individual beings, and what it looks like to try and spread life, and spread a good life and sustain that for as long as possible in right relationship.
So thank you so much, Emilia Roig. Thank you so much, Camille Barton, for being here and sharing such a significant, beautiful, and transformative work. A big thanks to every person who has been with us during this session. My name is Carlo Fernandes. It was lovely to be here with you all.
Thank you so much. It's been
Thank you,
amazing.
really nice.
Yeah. It's been
sweet
wonderful.
Conversation.
Thank you, Carla, for walking us through this conversation, and Camille, I'm so grateful for this conversation. Thank you.